So I know just enough to be dangerous. However, I've learned a lot today, and it's good to have an association with Nexco. Frank keeps me up to date. But this morning we've heard a lot about innovation. I think David Bray really spoke about that. We heard from a panel of change agents. So my first question for you gentlemen is, can you both share any examples that you're seeing in the public sector where cloud is helping and being innovative?
Sure. You want me to lead off, Mike?
Yeah, please.
So, a big part of my job as Red Hat Consulting is really just taking the products in our ecosystem and our partners and really kind of making them work for the government. It's not really vendor specific, it's also looking across the landscape of both innovation, open source, and that may include hardware vendors, software vendors, et cetera. So a lot of the examples that we're seeing today, like a few years ago we talked about cloud, it was really focused around almost virtualization. It was really focused on taking data centers, consolidating them, and making them more proficient. At this point, what we're seeing is a lot more innovation outside on the edge towards the mission, where you're actually getting both application developers faster, whether it be a VM or some sort of app hosting container, or you're also seeing the missions on the very tactical edge being able to consume services faster and quicker. So we've really changed the conversation over the last couple of years. I think the partnerships that a lot of the vendors out in the community work together and kind of offer, push that innovation. We certainly see all the challenges that were just mentioned prior to this session with legislative and acquisition, et cetera. But at the same time, we're seeing a lot more consumption that's getting to the end user, and that's probably the most exciting part about untapping that potential.
Yeah, and I would just add to that. I think Dr. Bray set the conversation up perfectly when he talked about this notion of exponential. We live in an exponential world. Things are changing so rapidly in our space right now that people that are customers that we experience that are really, truly driving innovation are taking advantage of open source type techniques and capabilities to be able to try to just keep pace with the exponential world that they're living in. From organizations like the National Security Agency that's been driving open source for many, many years, and the mission that they confront with the massive amount of data that they have to deal with, to organizations like NASA that have been kind of leading the way with public cloud usage and the work that they do around open source in order to solve very difficult computational mathematical problems. We see these agencies kind of leading the way for the rest of the government of kind of driving a new form of innovation in an exponential world, because we can't think linearly anymore.
That's great examples, thank you. And then your colleague, Dave X, I thought spoke a lot about migration to the cloud and sort of the how and the what. So my second question is, regardless of where an organization is on the cloud adoption spectrum, can you give us examples of areas that they would need to focus on, regardless of where they are in the
Sure.
process?
I mean, obviously, I think the greenfield approach of having a brand new data center with shiny lights and new machines and spinning that out to the actual private cloud is kind of it's a farce in a lot of the government agencies that we work with, because there's so much historical data, mission data, consumer data. There's applications, that we mentioned. So, part of that journey needs to be identifying the right targets and the right situations to start migrating to a cloud. I think that's the biggest part of that incremental kind of growth. And what you're seeing is a lot of optimization in the data center. Then as you want the exponential scale and growth, whether it be compute power, networking power, that's where you start to identify what programs or projects or applications you want to target.
Yeah, just to put a kind of a bullet at the end of that, it's really about standardizing, which we've been talking about with data center consolidation for many, many years, and then ultimately, trying to automate what we're doing inside of data centers. And I think kind of collectively in industry now, when we talk about a data center, it's not a physical place anymore. It's a set of compute resources wherever they exist to take advantage of. But if you haven't standardized, then the conversations previously about knowing your apps, if you haven't standardized the infrastructure underneath of them, you can't possibly understand the impact of the apps that they're going to have on that infrastructure underneath of it. So I think the knowledge is about the standardization, and ultimately the automation is what allows you to do things on-prem, in the cloud, hybrid clouds types of concepts.
Okay, great. So I met you all before, and you seem to get along pretty well.
Yeah.
And you're good partners. So one of the questions I had, and David Bray talked a lot about the evolving landscape. You just mentioned, breakneck speed, it's exponential. So it's also competitive, right? So what I want to know is how is your partnership unique? How do you guys work together in this environment?
Representing Cisco, I think Cisco is known as a networking company. We're an infrastructure company, and we're often called kind of the plumbers of the network, if you will. And that puts us if you look at a stack, an application stack, if you will, that puts us in an interesting place inside of that stack. And we tend to be at the infrastructure layer. Certainly we're expanding out in tangential markets. We don't just do routers and switches anymore, but it's still a lot of infrastructure capabilities. And there's massive disruption happening in just that part of the stack alone. Okay. Things like software-defined networking are coming around, the idea of automating networks themselves, virtualizing networks themselves. That's disrupting the world that I live in. And at the same time, everyone's trying to move up the stack and be more relevant and be able to deal with applications, the impact of applications on the infrastructure and vice versa. That's where our partnership with Red Hat is unbelievably complementary. And that Red Hat tends to live much further up the stack. We tend to live at kind of the hardware. People have talked about bare metal, whatever hardware down. We tend to meet Red Hat at the hypervisor, operating system, middleware, application above it. And we found we have this kind of great relationship because we're sort of teaching each other as the world moves to a interdependent application and infrastructure world. We're kind of helping each other figure these two worlds out.
Yeah. And I think a lot of the interoperability of different platforms, whether it be Red Hat or others, also works really well with Cisco because you could basically, like we said, not be locked into a certain solution or stack. And I think the way that we work together in that manner is very open, it's very friendly. Our engineering teams work directly together. Our support staff will actually, like I think Dave mentioned, the CVD that we have. So we have a Cisco validated design. You can literally package up and bundle, and it's supported by our teams. It's the way it should actually be integrated. So we're making those investments not just for the government, but also for industry to help further along that relationship as well. And I think by having a very open approach to each other's footprints, it also gives us a lot of opportunities for efficiencies on what we're trying to do at Red Hat. We are typically, when someone sees the Shadowman logo, they think Linux, Linux, Linux. And I think part of what we've done as an organization has really gone out into a lot of the cloud and also the application arena. So it allows us to have a lot of conversations in places where consumers are looking to meet, again, going back to the mission, they're looking for front-end mobile applications. Like we have complementary offerings for that. We can figure out ways to scale up and scale down with different hybrid architectures, including Cisco. So as we're up all the way up onto the consumer device, all the way back down to the data center, having partnerships like Cisco allow us to really build a system that isn't so, fragile. And that's the biggest problem that we have with going into a new environment is not knowing all the dependencies of all the other vendors. So by having a trusted advisor, it makes it a lot more comfortable for us.
Yeah, I think that's a really critical piece. We talk about, I've been in the network industry for over 20 years now, and we talk about open, which generally what we're saying is we're standards based. So you could take company A's box and company's B box and they could talk to each other. That's based on standards. But is it really open when you have proprietary hardware running proprietary software on top of it? Right. In an open source world, when we talk to Red Hat, absolutely not. That's not open. That's the proprietary world. And so I think, again, kind of what we're learning is this constant demand to say, no, just doing things that are standards-based is not sufficient. If you don't have truly open, transparent capabilities, if you're not contributing to upstream communities, you're not open. And the downside of that is then you don't get the benefit of the community. That certainly companies that are ecosystem partners, but beyond us, the community that's contributing to these things, where real exponential innovation can happen based on that huge community of the open source community. That's what we've seen in the world that I live in inside of Cisco, is that, wow, this unbelievably untapped potential to truly deal with an exponential world. And again, I mean, back to the partnership, that's kind of what we're learning that. Red Hat's demanding from us and helping us grow and expand.
And just to kind of tag on to that, I mean, it's also not just for the government sector. So our commercial counterparts are working just as closely as we are. So when we talk about innovation curves and a lot of the the challenges that were talked about today, a lot of times our commercial brothers, they'll be maybe a step ahead, or they'll have different concepts and ideas, and our collaboration into that industry brings a lot of stuff back to the government side, a lot. And that, again, having that open environment, not just from a code or a technology standpoint, but from a an environment and like a personality, communication, that allows us to really fuel innovation, both here in the public sector, but also outside.
And I think, I'm sorry, we've now
go ahead,
hijacked your
go
panel.
ahead.
but-
It's all
let you in
right.
a minute.
But this idea of this open
got me
community extends to open organizations, it extends to open government, it extends to truly, I mean, it is a truly democratized world and how you commit code. And yeah, there's some politics and people get upset about it, but the fact that we all could contribute to this, I mean, that's really the experiment of democracy that we talked about earlier. It's not, we're not stuck in a proprietary world. We don't need to be. And so that's a really cool thing in a world where you need innovation because things are happening so fast.
Yeah.
Now that leads me right to my next question, which is, I felt we heard a lot today about, on the panel in particular, examples within the public sector.
Sure.
But because you have that connection to the private sector, can you share examples of
Sure.
best practices there that could facilitate or help public sector?
Yeah, the nice part of covering, so my personal coverage is both federal, state, local, and education. And Mike and I have worked on several programs. When you go out to the edges of the missions for education, state and local, you run into a lot of scenarios. We recently were working with a group that was doing cancer research. So they were doing very much an academic study of cancer research, but they needed basically a cloud-based solution to do heavy compute power. So what we ended up doing was we partnered both with Cisco and with our federally funded kind of organization on the education side, and we ended up bringing in a lot of our commercial our commercial friends as well that are covering big financial big healthcare organizations up in like the Northeast.
Okay.
So we were able to kind of take the commercial aspects of what they're doing from research and patents and all the other fun stuff that goes into that field, bring those best practices as far as how to implement that from a technical stack to be able to meet the missions on our side. So it kind of goes back and swings back and forth between the two organizations. And that was just a really good example of not only working together collaboratively in meeting the mission, but also bringing in outside industry experience into our market, I guess.
Yeah, we've learned a few things from our commercial industry inside of Cisco that definitely plays back into the public sector. And certain things like, if you're a very small startup type organization, the public offerings are brilliant for when you're trying to get a business going. Most of the government is not in a startup mode, so it's like, just understanding why is there so much hype around public clouds? Well, a lot of it is because there's small companies trying to get started up, and the cost of infrastructure to get going is so low. That was the wildfire spread, in my opinion, of the initial public clouds. Then we've seen in our largest customers, our global, top 5 customers, if you will, have worked with cloud. They've tried to consume cloud services. They've really brought about this concept of hybrid because there's certain intellectual property things or data sovereignty issues because they're global that they've wrestled with, and really they've wrestled with the idea of speed, agility, and cost. And I think that's what we talk a lot about when it comes to cloud. And our biggest global customers have realized that they actually can leverage certain open source things like OpenStack, continue to build their own capabilities, and do it in a more nimble, more cost-effective way than a public cloud provider can do for them. So there's these interesting breakpoints in the price curve, and there's breakpoints in the speed curve, if you will, that some of these bigger, more sophisticated customers, which I would argue a lot of the government have learned that public clouds are not necessarily a panacea. They have their place, they have their use, and really that's where the hybrid cloud concept was born.
I think we heard that from the panel too. So I'm going to ask each of you a question about your organizations. Cisco is, well known as an infrastructure staple, in the commercial and the public sector world. So can you share with us what role infrastructure plays in this?
Sure.
And that's
So I have kind of
your
2
area of
points to make
expertise.
this. And I think for a while at Cisco, we were kind of down on ourselves that we were just plumbers. And it was like, we really want to be more relevant in the conversation. And we do, and we think we are because we're such a large part of the conversation. But we can't underestimate the impact of the infrastructure on our ultimate mission. So when we talk about high-level missions of agencies or businesses, that infrastructure has become so critical. We talked about an email outage, the impact of an email outage based on one piece of infrastructure going down and making a decision about good guys and bad guys. I mean, that shows, that illustrates the power of the infrastructure that it can have on the mission. So Cisco's role in this is twofold. First, we believe very strongly in the open hybrid cloud. We are a big proponent, and we're driving and leading the way to say we have to live in a world of many clouds. It's not sufficient to have your on-prem stuff in one cloud provider and call that your hybrid cloud and call it a day. We don't build networks that way. You know, networks started out as these silos of networks. They'd only talk to each other inside of buildings or on campuses, and we connected those together. That's what has to happen in the cloud world. It's not in the cloud provider's interest to do that, to share workloads between each other. So we're stepping in with a large ecosystem of people and saying, hey, this is not sufficient. We need a world of many clouds. The clouds need to talk to each other. And these aren't concepts that just apply in the public cloud world. So I love to use the example in the intelligence community. They've talked about this publicly. The cloud that CIA built with commercial best practices by Amazon, NSA's built a comparable cloud with government cloud best practices. Those two clouds live in an SCI world inside the government. Boy, wouldn't it be great if those could talk to each other? So when Tony talked about information sharing, how do we make those two clouds talk to each other? That's a hybrid cloud that's not in a public construct. So I think the ideas apply no matter what kind of data center and cloud type technologies we're building. The other thing I'll say is I think when software-defined networking started, Cisco was painted with this broad brush of being the old guard, the proprietary hardware with proprietary software, and there's a transformation happening in the infrastructure industry. And sure, there are some small startup companies that are doing some very disruptive things in a very positive way. But I would tell you, if you still think of us as a proprietary kind of old guard company, take a look at all the work we're doing, all the upstream commits we're making in the open source through GitHub and other places, around OpenStack, around controllers in the software-defined networking space like Open Daylight and things like that. And then everyone talks about, everyone. I like to think everyone talks about our application-centric infrastructure, which is the idea of building policies at a higher level and then being able to drive your infrastructure through that. All of that stuff is being done through the standards bodies and committed out into open source. So I think those are the two big impacts we're trying to have in this realm.
Of course, I want to turn to you. You said in your comments earlier, you referenced open source Linux. Mm-hmm. And so I think people associate Red Hat with that. But in the changing environment, sure. How is Red Hat changing and evolving?
Yeah, so one of the things that I came down to this area about 10 years ago, and one of the things that you found across the board was when you bring Red Hat to the table, everyone thinks Linux, Red Hat Enterprise Linux. Right. And one of the things that's really changed over the last 10 years has been the industry has created new projects and associated them up to our products in efforts like OpenStack, and there are other organizations like Google, Kubernetes. So a lot of what Red Hat's been contributing is into a lot of open source projects outside of just our core Linux kernel. Now, what that's also done is allowed us to accelerate our JBoss, which is our middleware application platform, and all the ancillary technologies in that stack as well. Ultimately, what we can deliver today is a really good end user experience. And that is something that when people typically think about Red Hat, they thought data center, dark room, lights flashing. And now we're actually talking about how can we get your data to your consumer faster. And it's not just about processing power, and it's not just about data center. It's really about, can you get through your app tier? Where can you modernize in an open source capacity all the way up to your mobile phone? So having that type of a investment, and obviously from an open source perspective, we're the de facto leader. And Red Hat really focuses on nobody is better than everybody. So we always talk about, we're not just contributing to the open source code. We're working with Cisco. We're working with other vendors, people, institutions that are actually making all these projects out in the community better. It's our job to certify them and support them in a manner that's safe for the government and for our commercial entities.
Great. Well, gentlemen, we're just about out of time. So I want to say, do you have anything to add today Any closing remarks?
No, I obviously just appreciate the time. Obviously, Mike and I are here. If anyone has any questions afterwards, feel free to grab us.
Yeah, and I guess I would just say one more time that we do live in an exponential world, and open source can really help us stay relevant in that conversation.
Absolutely.
Great. Thank you so much. Let's give them a round of applause. Thank you all for joining us today. I want to thank Red Hat and Cisco for underwriting today's program, all of the outstanding speakers that took time to be with us today, and all of you, of course, in the audience for joining us. I hope to see you at future NextGov events. Have a great day, and thanks so much.
Thank you.